In the summer of 1834, New York reeked of something more than rot. The cholera had returned, spilling through alleys and gutters like a curse long promised. People dropped in streets with blue-tinged lips and sunken eyes, their bodies trembling before stilling like broken marionettes. The newspapers called it divine punishment. The churches called it sin. The doctors, those who stayed, called it unsolvable. But then came Dr. Horace Vey, pale, reedy, and young enough to be dismissed by older men of medicine. He arrived with a calm so unnatural it quieted even the rats. His new clinic, erected with city funds and charitable donations, sat in the long shadow of the debtors' prison, where coughing echoed day and night like a hymn of the damned. The building was modern by comparison, its white facade blinding in the sun, the windows all perfectly square. Inside, it smelt of boiled cloth and faint alcohol. The waiting rooms were quiet, strangely so, even when full. Mothers clutched babies too weak to cry. Men with hollow cheeks sat beside them, leaking from both ends, their eyes glazed but not closed. No one dared speak louder than a whisper. Dr. Vey walked those halls like a priest among lepers, never flinching at the smell or the moans. He did not raise his voice, nor did he rush. His gloves were always fresh, his coat always pressed. He believed in antiseptic before antiseptic had a name. He ordered that each cot be cleaned every 2 hours. He burnt linens daily. He demanded windows stay open even in the rain, claiming death needed stale air to root. To most, he seemed a godsend. Even the mayor visited once, shaking his pale hand and calling him the hope of Lower Manhattan. But the ones who arrived unconscious never left through the front door. That much was whispered by the girls in laundry aprons who washed out the bloodstains he insisted were from teeth extractions. They didn't ask questions, he paid well, and the cholera had made work scarce. But sometimes they found smudged handprints on the floor beneath the beds. Sometimes there were ropes coiled too neatly under linen carts. Sometimes they counted patients in the morning and counted fewer at dusk. Behind the pristine hallways and sterilized wards was a narrow set of stairs, always locked, leading to what Vey called the overflow study chamber. It was never shown to donors nor spoken of in board meetings. He kept the only key on a chain beneath his shirt. He told his staff that the overflow was for bodies too far gone, too infectious to keep above. But the undertakers never came for them. No carts rolled out the back. The sick who went down simply became part of the building. One nurse, a girl of 17 named Louisa, lasted 3 weeks before quitting mid-shift, muttering to herself that the floors whispered when she scrubbed them. She never picked up her wages. The city praised Vey's low death statistics. Other clinics were losing 5, sometimes 10 per day. His clinic claimed only 2 had perished all summer. Some doctors grew suspicious, but when they visited unannounced, Vey would smile and usher them through spotless rooms filled with stable patients sipping broth and murmuring gratitude. He never raised his voice. He never blinked too long. When one physician asked to see the records of deceased patients, Vey showed him a single logbook with 3 neat entries signed and dated. The ink was fresh. Too fresh. But no one challenged him. No one wanted to believe the miracle was a lie. By August, people were calling him the saint of the sick. His face appeared in pamphlets about reform. His name was invoked in sermons. He wrote to the city board recommending wider implementation of his clean clinic model. He even offered to train others. But no one asked how his patients died. No one asked where the bodies went. They only saw his calm hands, his spotless floors, and the way he always walked away from the sick without needing to look back. And beneath those floors, in rooms no architect remembered drawing, the walls were sweating. Something pulsed softly in the dark, like breath caught between ribs. The smell down there wasn't filth. It was metal, old cotton, and something sweeter, like a fruit that had been carved open too early. But above it all, the city rejoiced. A miracle had arrived, and no one dared question its price. Not yet. Dr. Vey believed that death did not begin with the stopping of the heart, but with the quiet exit of something deeper. Something he called presence. To most, a comatose patient was still alive. But to Vey, stillness had shades, layers, and textures only he could read. He would walk into a ward filled with the wheezing and rattling of cholera victims and pause by a single bed, staring down at a pale face until a nurse would ask if he needed assistance. He never answered right away. He simply tilted his head as if listening to a silent confession. Then he would nod once and whisper that this one had entered the pre-death state, the vital hum gone, the soul long retreated. The others were taught not to argue. His certainty was unnerving. Not arrogant, but detached, like he was taking notes on something already buried. He kept a separate book for these patients. Not for their conditions, but for what he called departure signs. Facial tightness around the temples, uneven cheekbones, and dryness behind the earlobes. Over time, the notes became darker, more cryptic. He began drawing maps of their faces with red ink, circling what he called vessels of vacancy. At first, the nurses assumed it was part of his method, eccentric but harmless. Then one night, a young girl named Hetty was brought in. She had collapsed in a boarding house on Delancey Street and was barely breathing when they laid her down. Her fingers twitched. Her lips moved soundlessly. But Vey took one look and claimed she had already passed through the veil. He scribbled a note, "Departure confirmed," and ordered her moved to the overflow study chamber. No pulse check, no saline, no breath against glass. Just a quick look at her eyelids and she was deemed spiritually vacated. The attendants hesitated, but his tone was colder than usual that night. He insisted they were wasting care on a vessel that had nothing left inside. The girl was wheeled away. The next morning, one nurse claimed she heard cries echoing up from the basement vents. Not moans, cries. Words. But by the time she ran downstairs, the doors were locked. Vey dismissed the story as hysteria brought on by stress. But that same day, he changed the clinic's intake process. From then on, he would personally assess each new patient for what he called facial symmetry degradation. He began measuring jaws with calipers. He stared too long at pupils even when they were still. He started rejecting certain patients entirely, refusing them treatment, claiming their presence was uncertain. When pressed, he explained that the soul had become fragile in some, easier to sever, less likely to stay. His language was medical only in tone, never in logic. But the board let him continue. His clinic's death toll was still the lowest in the city. By autumn, his private chambers were filled with sketches. Dozens of charcoal faces, their features distorted by red lines, numbers, and circles. He claimed to have discovered a pattern, that as death approached, the human face lost its natural geometry. He wrote that symmetry was the soul's anchor, and when it fractured, what remained was just noise. In one letter never sent, he wrote that some faces had never held symmetry to begin with, that some were born empty, that perhaps they had only mimicked the living. He kept that letter beneath his pillow. Nurses began to notice odd routines. Patients chosen by Vey for study were given a cloth infused with a bitter-smelling solution and tied around their heads. A cleansing bandage, he called it, meant to neutralize the last remnants of panic. He claimed it soothed them and helped him observe them without interference. But some nurses said they saw the patients flinch when it touched their skin. One even claimed to hear low murmuring from behind the closed doors where he conducted his research. When asked what he did in there, Vey responded with a calmness that chilled the room. He said he simply watched. He watched the body forget it was ever human. It was during this time that a boy named Tobias was brought in. 10 years old, fevered but conscious, eyes darting and lips dry. Vey examined him in silence, then wrote in his book, "Vacated, despite vitality." When the nurse protested and saying the child had spoken her name, Vey's face shifted ever so slightly. Not anger, not frustration. Something worse, mild disappointment, as if the nurse had failed a lesson she didn't know she was being taught. Tobias was removed from the main ward by midnight. His bed was stripped by morning. No record of his death was filed. More nurses began leaving without notice. One of them, a man who had worked at Bellevue before the outbreak, told his brother before departing that there was something about Vey's stillness that made silence feel violent. The remaining staff learnt to speak in short sentences. Do not ask about the ones taken to the lower chambers. To accept that some of the bodies had never really been alive, even if they wept, even if they begged. And through it all, Dr. Vey smiled faintly in his mirror each morning, noting the symmetry in his own face. He believed it meant he was still full, still tethered, still real. But late at night, when the halls were quiet and the clinic slept, he sometimes pressed a cold finger to his own jawline, searching for a crack he couldn't see, just in case. Beyond the rows of gleaming bottles and labeled vials in Dr. Vey's supply chamber was a shelf that did not hold medicine at all. It sat flush against the wall, unmoving to the untrained eye. But Vey knew the right place to press. Just beneath the second bottle of cod liver oil, behind a square of discolored wood. With a soft creak, the shelf slid back, revealing a corridor barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. The walls were lined in glazed tile, polished clean, so bright it nearly blinded. This was the ether window, his name for the passage between false death and understanding. No one was permitted entry except Vey and, on rare occasions, the boy Jonas, who had learnt early not to look directly at the faces inside. The corridor held no scent, no draft, no signs of movement. It was dead air by design. They believed even a breath could interfere with purity. The room at the end was lined with a single metal slab and 3 small shelves. Each shelf held one thing: a stopwatch, a brass syringe, and a white cloth folded into squares. This was not a surgical room. It was a place of calculation. They called it a study, though there were no books. Only a journal with a cracked leather spine where he recorded the reactions to a substance he named eleutherin, a clear, odorless solution he claimed he discovered by accident when combining chalk powder, sheep bile, and laudanum sediment. Its effects were extraordinary. Within 20 seconds of entering the bloodstream, the patient would lose all voluntary motor control. By 30 seconds, the lungs stopped responding to panic, and by 40, the body entered a full stillness, not death, but something close. What fascinated Vey most was that the brain remained fully awake for several minutes. He tested this not by guesswork, but by design. Before each administration, he would whisper instructions into the patient's ear, sometimes simple. Blink once for yes, twice for no. Other times crueler, more inventive. Once he asked a girl to count how many times he tapped her forehead with a metal rod. After the paralysis set in, her eyes flicked back and forth 6 times in sequence. He noted it with a quiet smile. The real genius, he believed, was in the silence. Eleutherin blocked inner resonance, meaning the ears stopped transmitting even internal sounds. No heartbeat, no breath, no voice in the head. He called it perfect sensory severance. He theorized that in those minutes the patient no longer believed they were alive. That absence of noise created a vacuum in the mind, a vacuum where truth could slip in if guided properly. So he began introducing stimuli. A flashing lantern placed inches from their pupils, a needle pressed to the nail bed just until blood pooled. He never broke the skin. He never left a mark. He insisted these tests were non-lethal, and so far no subject had died in the chamber. At least not officially. Some failed to return to full cognition. They woke unable to form words or with a trembling that never stopped. He transferred those cases to municipal care under the heading neurological shock. The city never questioned his diagnoses. Each session was timed. From the moment of injection to the moment of return, Vey watched the stopwatch with the intensity of a man listening to God. If the patient remained paralyzed longer than 7 minutes, he administered a heated poultice to the chest and whispered the word "awake" over and over until the pupils moved. One girl took 9 minutes to stir. When she blinked, tears streamed from her eyes, not of relief but something deeper. Vey recorded it as re-entry trauma. He considered it progress. That night he increased the dosage by 10%. Jonas, the boy assistant, was taught to hold a mirror above each patient's mouth, not to check breath, but to watch how the fog evaporated. Vey believed it revealed how strongly the body fought to remain real. In one case, the mirror stayed clear the entire time. He kept the girl an hour longer, believing she had transcended the boundary between soul and shell. She didn't scream when she woke. She only stared, jaw slack. When she was wheeled out, her feet dragged on the floor. Her family was told she survived a fever-induced seizure. The truth was recorded only in the cracked journal, under the heading "Perfect Vacant State, Trial Number 11. Vey kept the used clothes folded beside him, soaking them afterward in alcohol and storing them in labeled jars. Some bore faint blood smudges. Others held only the faintest scent of fear, the kind that lingers when a body understands too late that it cannot move. He believed these clothes held memories. That touch could preserve terror better than sound. On quiet nights, he would open one and press it to his own cheek, closing his eyes to imagine what they must have seen, frozen in place, unable to scream, unable even to hear themselves beg. As weeks passed, he refined the method. He began selecting patients not by illness, but by emotional openness. Those who smiled too quickly, those who hesitated before asking for help. He said they offered cleaner entries into the ether. He believed that the mind, stripped of noise and body, could be guided to revelation. That suffering, when silenced, turned to shape, and shape could be studied. Shaped minds could be replicated. And in the deepest part of the chamber, just beyond the reach of the lantern's glow, a wall had begun to stain with faint marks, shapes like fingerprints or ashes pressed into tile. They did not clean them. He believed it meant something was watching back, that perhaps the ether had a window of its own. Tucked behind a false panel in Dr. Vey's study desk, beneath layers of old surgical licenses and folded newspaper clippings praising his epidemic miracle, was a book bound in soft gray hide. The spine was unmarked. The pages, aged unevenly, held ink that shimmered slightly when held to lamplight. It was his private record, Sainum, not of patients but of thoughts. It was not meant for medical eyes. Written entirely backward and in fractured Latin, the text was nearly illegible to anyone else. But to Vey, each line was a hymn of clarity. The journal didn't speak of healing. It spoke of design, of correcting flaws in the human process, of reimagining suffering as refinement. One passage, written 3 weeks into the cholera outbreak, read, "Mercy must be stripped from compassion like flesh from fat. One can be useful, the other sedates." He believed kindness dulled the mind, and that pain, when framed correctly, could awaken truth. And in this logic he found purpose, not in curing but in sculpting, not in easing death but in making its threshold visible, touchable. And for that he needed a vessel who could cross that boundary without judgment. He found one in Jonas. Jonas had come to the clinic mute and half-starved, a boy of perhaps 12. though his birth records were lost in a warehouse fire no one ever investigated. He had been found near the edge of the canal, eyes clouded from untreated infection, arms wrapped tight around a dead crow. When asked why he wouldn't eat, he shook his head and whispered once that the bird had kept him warm. No one asked more. Vey took him in, not as a ward, but as a subject, not to test, but to sharpen. He believed blindness allowed Jonas to move without moral recoil. That without sight the boy could offer presence without pity, proximity without projection. Vey trained him slowly, gently, first to hold a hand, then to trace fingers, then to know, by touch alone, when the muscles beneath the skin began to stiffen with terror. Jonas never recoiled. He never asked questions. He stood beside the paralyzed and dying with a quiet so unnatural it unsettled the nurses more than the cries from below the clinic floor. In one entry, Vey wrote of a test he designed specifically for Jonas, a ritual disguised as comfort. Patients marked as near departure were taken to the observation room, where Jonas would be seated behind them. He was told to place his palm flat against the spine just beneath the neck and press until he could feel the heartbeat through bone. Vey believed this point, the vertebral gateway, was where the soul clung before release. He instructed Jonas to whisper into their ears not words but tones. Vibrations, frequencies that mimicked the pitch of breath. He believed it confused the body into believing it was still loved. The goal was not to soothe. It was to slow the process, to stretch the death moment into something malleable, something he could measure. The boy never cried, never looked away. Once when a patient tried to scream mid-process and managed only a strained, broken sob, Jonas gently wiped a tear from her eye and whispered something that made her still again. The nurse watching fainted. Vey later wrote that Jonas had become more tool than Boyd, a pure extension of purpose. He described him with admiration but also with hunger, as if Jonas had tapped into something Vey could only observe from the edge. In another passage, he confessed a thought he never shared aloud, that Jonas had been delivered, not found, that his blindness was a gift, that perhaps he was born without the burden of seeing evil, so he could carry it without breaking. Vey began dressing him in white robes, clean and unadorned. He said it calmed the patients. But really it made Jonas seem unearthly, almost spectral, as if death itself had sent an envoy to assist. Rumors grew among the staff. Some claimed Jonas never slept. Others said he hummed old lullabies that no one had taught him. A few swore he walked the halls barefoot and that wherever he paused, the walls grew colder. But Vey never addressed these stories. He only reminded the staff that Jonas was part of the process. That comfort, even false comfort, increased the reliability of observation. In a final entry dated with no year, Vey wrote about a breakthrough. A night when a woman in full paralysis, tears streaking her cheeks, reached out and found Jonas's hand, and in doing so, calmed instantly. He wrote that the body, even in terror, would seek illusion over truth, that a child's touch, when stripped of intention, was more powerful than morphine. He ended the entry with 5 words, underlined twice. She thought he was mercy. But Jonas never smiled when he comforted them, not once. And in the rare hours he wandered alone, he could sometimes be found in the linen room, pressing his own hand flat against his chest, searching for something he could never quite feel. She arrived just before dawn, wrapped in a blood-flecked shawl, her eyes wide but silent. The intake ledger listed her only as Lena, no surname, no known family. A seamstress by trade, they said, the kind who stitched in silence, lips sealed not by illness but by something older, something chosen. She had not spoken since childhood, though none could say why. When her fever began, she told no one. By the time she collapsed in the alley behind the threadworks on Bayard Street, her skin had turned the color of wet ash. Most would have passed her over, thinking her beyond help. But Vey was alerted by one of his scouts. Boys paid in bread and coin to fetch him the ones who breathed wrong. The moment he saw her face, he paused. Her jawline was narrow, delicate, and perfectly symmetrical, even in distress. He noted how the muscles around her mouth did not twitch with pain, how the lines beneath her eyes held no pleading. She did not weep. She did not flinch. To him, she was ideal. Vey's journal from that week contained a single passage scrawled in haste. Spiritual compression possible in mute vessels. If the soul cannot exit through confession, will it seek other paths? He believed the human spirit, when trapped, would try to leave by unnatural means, the ears, the skin, even the space between breaths. But what if it could be caught? What if it could be sealed in place? That question, once it took root in his mind, bloomed with terrifying clarity. He called the procedure a soul seam, a method he claimed would contain the departing essence long enough to study its response. He explained to no one. The staff, now accustomed to strange orders cloaked in medical language, prepared the table. Lena was cleaned, restrained, and dosed not with a sedative, but with the smallest measure of eleutherin, just enough to suppress movement but not awareness. Vey needed her eyes open. The operation lasted 3 hours, with slow, practiced hands. He carved a curved incision beneath her chin, not deep enough to sever, but just enough to form a second mouth. The lips were synthetic, crafted from preserved tissue and stitched into the opening with black silk thread. He aligned them carefully, matching the curve of her natural mouth so they mirrored one another in silence. When finished, he wrote that her body now contained dual thresholds of spirit. He claimed that if his theory held, the soul would become confused during departure, unable to decide which exit to take, and in its hesitation become visible. He placed mirrors at both ends of the chamber. He ordered Jonas to sit by her bed with a lantern and note any flickers, any shapes that passed across the glass when she slept. Nothing came. On the second day, Lena developed a cough that rattled from deep in her chest. Blood seeped from both mouths. Vey observed with reverence, sketching the way the stains formed mirrored lines across her neck. He described it as an ache of division, as if the body itself mourned its confusion. She ate only when forced. She slept in fits, eyes open more often than not. She never screamed. But by the 4th day, her pulse began to rise inexplicably between dusk and midnight. They believed it was the soul trying to flee, panicking as its path was blocked. He ordered cool cloths to be placed over both mouths and instructed Jonas to press his fingers to her temples and hum at intervals. This, he claimed, would lull the spirit back into stillness. But Lena began to tremble. By the 7th day, the second mouth began to open on its own. Not wide, not violently, just enough that the stitches strained. Vey refused to reinforce them. He said the tension was necessary, that the soul must feel the resistance. One nurse claimed to see her lips move in sleep, both sets at once, forming shapes that didn't match. She said it looked like prayer, but in reverse. That night, Jonas found a piece of thread torn from the seam tucked beneath Lena's palm. Vey believed it was a sign that the soul was attempting self-repair or perhaps ritual protest. He preserved the thread in a vial labeled Lucid Defiance No. 3. On the 9th day, Lena's breathing became labored. The skin around the second mouth had begun to blacken. Vey insisted it was not necrosis, but spiritual scarring. He treated it with warm oil and repeated scripture not from the Bible but from his own journal. phrases he had written to calm himself during earlier experiments. He believed his voice carried resonance that tethered the spirit in place. Jonas was told to hold her hands tighter now, to keep her anchored. But the tremors returned. On the 11th day, Lena stopped blinking. Her pupils contracted, then widened, then settled into something else entirely. A glassy stare that seemed neither awake nor unconscious. Both mouths remained slightly open. Blood had dried along the edges like wax. Vey watched for an hour without moving, convinced he would see the soul rise in frustration or fracture. When nothing came, he stood, removed his gloves and whispered, "She has agreed to remain." Her body was moved to the chamber below, stored in a glass box filled with alcohol and milk. He believed the mix preserved not just tissue but memory. Nurses were forbidden from viewing her. Only Jonas was allowed inside. He was instructed to sit beside her daily and listen, not for breath, not for a heartbeat, but for anything else, anything that didn't belong. And when he listened long enough, he swore he heard it. A breath drawn inward, not outward, as if something inside still hadn't decided if it was ready to leave. In the weeks following Lena's slow decline, Dr. Vey's obsession turned to fragments. He began to insist that the soul was not a single flame but a leaking vessel, dripping traces of itself long before death. He taught himself to collect these leaks with the care of a jeweler handling gems. Fingernails were trimmed and kept in small glass jars. Strands of hair were bound in paper slips, each labeled with the patient's full name written in his impeccable script. But the most disturbing practice was the harvest of breath. As patients weakened, he would hold a thin funnel to their lips, forcing their last exhale into a wax-sealed vial. He believed air carried memory, and that when contained, it hardened into something measurable. He called these vials final notes, as if each was a single sound from a larger unfinished hymn. His study was filled with rows of these relics. Each vial was tagged with dates and initials, each lock of hair pinned to boards like rare specimens. At night he lit only a single lantern and walked slowly between them, whispering each name as he passed. He told himself he was preventing them from being forgotten. In truth, he was building a library of voices only he could hear. He began to speak of echoes, subtle sounds that appeared when fragments were combined. He believed nails gave resonance, hair gave pitch, and breath gave tone. If arranged properly, the fragments could sing. The wax cylinders came later. He had purchased a crude recording device, still rare in the city, claiming it was for dictation. But he did not use it to record words. Instead, he held the horn above dying patients and turned the crank slowly as they exhaled. The cylinders captured only faint hisses, sometimes interrupted by a rattle or cough. To anyone else, the recordings were meaningless noise. To Vey, they were seeds. He played them at night, one after another, until his study filled with layers of crackling whispers. He claimed that when he slowed the turn of the crank, he could hear names within the static, entire choruses calling back to him in fractured unity. The staff who overheard only heard shrieks of broken air, like wind through a splintered window. But Vey was convinced the patients were answering. Jonas was often present during these nightly rituals. The boy would sit cross-legged on the floor, eyes lifted toward the ceiling as the doctor spun the crank and leaned in close. Sometimes Jonas tilted his head as though listening to a lullaby only he understood. Once, when asked what he heard, he whispered simply, "They are waiting." Vey recorded that answer in his journal and underlined it twice. To him, it was proof that the fragments were not silent, that they had coherence, longing, and perhaps even unfinished business. The ritual grew more elaborate. Vey began arranging the vials into circles, lighting small candles in between and playing 3 cylinders at once. He would sit in the center, eyes closed, and trace patterns on the floor with chalk while whispering the names written on the jars. He believed the act did not summon spirits but synchronized them like tuning an instrument. He wanted to hear harmony, not chaos. And sometimes, after hours of repetition, he swore he did. A rise and fall in the static, a cadence of syllables, an unmistakable blending of tones, he wrote, "The dead do not vanish. They linger in shards, and shards, when pressed together, become a choir." But the choir was not gentle. The more he played the cylinders, the more restless the patients upstairs became. They began waking in the night, speaking names of strangers. One girl cried that she could hear voices beneath the floor calling her to join. Another refused to sleep, clawing her own arms to keep herself awake. When nurses begged him to stop, Vey accused them of cowardice. He claimed the agitation proved the experiment's success. The dead were close, too close for comfort. That was the point. By the end of winter, his study no longer felt like a clinic. It felt like a chapel. The vials lined the shelves like reliquaries. The wax cylinders were stacked in boxes like hymnals. And each night when the lantern burnt low, the doctor and the blind boy sat together, listening for the names hidden inside the noise. Some said the walls shook faintly during these hours. Others claimed the echoes spread into the halls, rattling through the pipes. But Vey only smiled at the thought. For him, the voices were proof that silence was never real. The dead only waited for someone willing to turn the crank and let them sing again, and he was ready to give them their stage. In the spring of that same year, Dr. Horace Vey turned his hunger toward the smallest and most fragile of forms. He began to petition the city hospitals, pleading that stillborn infants be released to him under the pretense of medical research. He claimed he sought to understand why breath failed at the threshold of life, to spare future mothers the pain of empty arms. The request, wrapped in language of compassion, was granted without suspicion. Yet when the infants arrived, each one swaddled in silence. Vey treated them not as failed lives, but as vessels waiting to be reignited. He placed their tiny bodies in glass domes filled with mineral water and herbs, surrounding them with tubing that hissed softly in the shadows. He called the room a sanctuary. To others it was a graveyard that refused to admit death. The most infamous attempt came when one infant, pale as wax, stirred beneath the water after he forced air into her lungs with his crude pump. The flutter lasted 13 seconds, a brief tremor of fingers against the glass before stillness returned. For Vey, those seconds were enough. He declared the child reborn, christened her Saint Eloise, and recorded the moment as proof that his doctrine of fragments applied even to beginnings cut short. He convinced himself the soul had only slipped, not vanished, and that he had pulled it briefly back into flesh. The staff who witnessed were broken by it, yet none dared intervene, for his voice carried the weight of certainty that smothered doubt. Soon after, he built her a nursery deep below the clinic, a place where lamps glowed dimly and cribs were lined not with cotton but with preserved specimens. Around Saint Eloise he gathered toys, wooden dolls whose carved mouths were fitted with tiny tubes. At night, as the boy Jonas kept watch, the dolls seemed to breathe faintly, as if mimicking the rhythm of sleeping children. They would stand in the doorway and whisper lullabies in Latin, convinced the sound coaxed the infant soul to linger. What he saw was not decay but potential, a congregation of saints not yet born, yet not fully lost. His paternal instinct, twisted by obsession, became liturgy. And so he sat among the dolls, among the glass domes, cradling silence as if it were a song, convinced that fatherhood could be manufactured in the dark. The further Dr. Horace Vey strayed from medicine, the more he convinced himself he was drawing closer to truth. By the winter of 1835, his journals described a new obsession. The belief that blood carried not only life but also intention. that within its dark flow lingered traces of memory and will. He constructed a crude filtration device in the hidden chambers beneath his clinic, a set of glass tubes lined with strips of tallow and living leeches. He claimed the leeches fed on corruption while the tallow absorbed grief, leaving behind blood freed from its burdens. What remained he called clarified essence, blood that could think without the weakness of the body that once held it. He began to inject this filtered blood into patients chosen at random, most of them weak from cholera or fever. At first they seemed to rally, their eyes brightening as if strength had returned. But soon their voices broke into screams, describing whispers in their skulls and dreams that did not belong to them. One woman sobbed that she had watched her own child drown in her sleep, though she had never borne children. Another man clawed at his skin, crying that hands not his own pressed against his chest each night. Their terror was treated as evidence, not tragedy. They recorded each collapse with satisfaction, calling them graftings of soul, proof that the essence of one life could be stitched into another like threads in cloth. He stored the remaining vials in neat rows, labeling them not with names but with single words: obedience, hunger, silence, rage. To him these were not symptoms but qualities, pieces of humanity distilled to their purest form. He believed that in time he could arrange them as one arranges organs, selecting the noblest fragments to rebuild a person free of weakness. Each cry of madness from his patients only deepened his conviction, as if the voices they heard were choirs of spirits made audible through his hand. And so, as the city above slept uneasy in its sickness, Vey sat below with his instruments and his vials of thinking blood, convinced he had taught death itself to speak. By the spring of 1836, the silence inside Dr. Vey's clinic had grown heavier than the disease it claimed to treat. Patients who entered its doors were no longer counted in the ledgers. Their names were written, then carefully erased, as if their lives had been swallowed whole by the building itself. The nurses who once whispered of strange movements at night were quietly dismissed, their pay withheld, their lodging notes lost. A few who pressed for answers vanished outright, leaving behind nothing but folded uniforms in locked trunks. What had begun as a hospital became something closer to a mausoleum with polished floors, its corridors filled with an unspoken dread too thick to challenge. Jonas remained, moving through those dim passages as though the silence itself had become his master. He no longer tended to patients directly. Instead, he wandered, humming soft lullabies to the plaster walls, pressing his hands flat against them as though listening for the trapped voices within. At night, attendants heard him repeating the names of those erased from the books, not as if mourning them, but as if trying to keep their presence alive in his own body. His blind eyes looked brighter in those hours, as though reflecting unseen candles, and no one dared to stop him. One former assistant, gaunt and trembling, returned after weeks of absence. He carried no medicine, only a small bundle of kerosene rags. In the outer offices, he lit the paper files one by one, the flame blackening records of the living and the dead alike. The fire consumed nothing vital, for Vey's true notes were hidden elsewhere, but the smoke clawed into the air like a broken testimony. He was dragged away before the flames could reach the cellar, yet his muttering voice carried through the streets. That beneath the walls something was wrong, something worse than fever or rot. The authorities, when summoned, made no case of it. To them, Dr. Vey had cured where others had abandoned hope, and if the cost was silence, they called it mercy. And so the hollow hours stretched on, not filled with cries or protests, but with a dreadful stillness, as if the city itself had agreed to forget what was happening in the rooms beneath the marble facade. It began with a book bound in gray leather, its pages ruled with precise lines and marked with ink that never blotted. Dr. Vey called it his census, though it bore no likeness to civic record-keeping. Each patient admitted into his care was given a number, not of weight or age, but of what he termed soul probability. This number was not measured by pulse, fever, or symptom. It was calculated in the quiet solitude of his office by angles of the face, length of the fingers, and the quiver in their breath when they were told they might live. In this ledger he ranked them as though the human spirit were no more than a commodity, and the lowest values always belonged to children. To him, the young were still unfinished vessels, and so their souls were weak, expendable, and suited for what he called release rather than cure. What followed was a season of quiet harvesting masked as benevolence. The corridors that once echoed with the cries of the sick grew thinner, quieter because the smallest voices were the first to vanish. Parents who returned to inquire were given papers stamped with official seals declaring that their children had succumbed quickly and painlessly. But in truth, the names of 87 children were written in Vey's hand over the span of 6 months, each one marked with a number no higher than 2. They were not remembered as individuals but as failed probabilities, dissolved into his arithmetic of morality. The nurses who questioned the numbers were dismissed or their concerns erased under the guise of incompetence. The city officials accepted his charts with gratitude, believing he was reducing contagion when, in truth, he was reducing humanity itself. For Vey, this ledger was no mere account book. It was scripture. He spoke to it as he wrote, whispering the numbers like prayers, convincing himself that he was not ending lives but filtering them, sieving the flawed from the worthy. He began to see his role not as doctor but as moral architect, reshaping the very composition of mankind by deciding which souls deserved to remain and which should be excised. The ink stains on his hands darkened into something more than work. They became the residue of judgment, a judgment only he believed himself righteous enough to deliver. And as he turned the page to mark yet another entry, the silence of his clinic thickened, waiting for what new arithmetic of cruelty would come next. It began with smoke curling through the cracks of the asylum's lower stones, a thick, bitter smell that rose like a secret finally forced into air. The underground nursery, that grotesque chamber where glass domes once held stillborn forms suspended in their false wombs, had turned into a furnace of broken glass and burning cloth. The dolls he had arranged along the shelves melted into shapes that no longer resembled toys but shrieking shadows fixed in wax. In the center of it all, where he had kept the body he called Saint Eloise, the fire blazed hottest, as if the child's absence had left behind a hunger that could only be fed by destruction. The heat shattered the jars of preserved remains, their contents running together into a black boiling mass that hissed when it struck the stone floor. Jonas was nowhere to be found. Some swore they had seen him earlier that evening, humming his broken lullabies near the stairwell, his small hands clasped as though in prayer. Yet when the flames erupted, his shadow disappeared, swallowed either by the fire or by some darker calling that none would ever name aloud. And then there was Vey himself, stepping into the street while the asylum belched smoke behind him. His face streaked with soot, his coat charred, and still he smiled as though witnessing a birth instead of ruin. When the firefighters asked what had happened, he whispered with the calm certainty of a man seeing prophecy fulfilled that she had walked at last, that the child who had once breathed for 13 seconds had finally taken her first true steps. The story of St. Eloise grew in the whispers of patients who survived the ward, their fevered minds twisting her into an icon of deliverance, a child saint who had escaped her glass cradle. Some claimed to hear her footsteps at night, soft and wet, pattering through the empty halls. But there was no official inquiry, no ledgers opened, and no blame assigned. The asylum doors were sealed by the city, not in condemnation but in quiet relief, as though they had always wished to look away. And in that silence, Vey's smile became more haunting than the fire itself, for it carried the peace of a man who believed his work had not ended in ashes but in revelation, and that the world outside was now his nursery waiting to be filled. 10 years had passed since the fire sealed the asylum and sent Dr. Vey into whispers and rumors. Time buried his name but not his reach. When the hospital began its expansion, workers struck upon a wall of stone thicker than the rest, an intrusion into their ordered blueprints. Behind it lay a staircase choked with dust, its steps slick with something that had once been oil, or perhaps something nearer to blood. The air was heavy and still, as though no breath had passed through it in years. And yet the workers spoke later of hearing something faint within, like a slow dripping, or the muffled sound of a heartbeat beneath the floor. When the wall gave way and the chamber opened, lantern light revealed shelves upon shelves of jars, their glass clouded but intact, each one filled not with water or organs arranged for study, but with preserved hearts suspended in a pale fluid that refused to spoil. Every heart was labeled, not with numbers alone, but with the precision of a bureaucrat, a full name, a date, and a ranking that matched the ledgers once whispered about in the asylum's records. There were hundreds of them, a choir of silent organs that had been stilled by his hand but held in waiting by his obsession. Some were small enough to have come from children barely old enough to walk. Others bore dark fissures across their surface, as though death had not been sudden but drawn out in strain, yet each was whole, preserved as though the life inside had been meant to pause, not end. In the center of the room stood a cradle. It was wooden, finely made, a piece that seemed almost tender in its craftsmanship. Yet there was nothing inside but shadows. The wood was not charred from the fire above, nor covered in dust like the stones surrounding it. When one of the workers placed his hand upon its edge, he flinched as though from a coal, insisting that it was warm to the touch. No lamp had stood near it, no ember had burnt for a decade, and still it seemed to breathe with a memory of life. That single cradle shifted the chamber from a hidden mortuary into a shrine, and the men who stood there did not speak for long. Silence fell as if the walls themselves were listening. Investigators followed after, their pens scratching dutifully as they catalogued names that no one remembered. Patients listed as cured in official ledgers, yet recorded here in jars of flesh. These were not anonymous remnants, but chosen vessels, each stolen from the body at its final moment, preserved by methods no one could replicate. The investigators noted that the earliest jars bore dates that aligned with the height of the cholera epidemic, while the latest reached to the very night of the fire. None bore Jonas's name. Some whispered that his heart must have been taken too, but if so, it was hidden elsewhere, perhaps fed into the cradle itself. No one spoke this speculation aloud, for the room carried a weight that felt like trespass. It was not just discovery, but interruption. The chamber was sealed once more, reported only in fragments, and filed away in archives under words like anomaly and historical curiosity. But those who had entered it did not leave unchanged. Several of the workers refused to continue the expansion, claiming that at night they could feel a pressure in their chest, a phantom throb that was not their own heartbeat but something heavier and slower, pulsing as if from beneath the floor. The investigator who touched the cradle fell into fever weeks later. His last delirium filled with muttered repetitions of the same word, Eloise. He claimed she was waiting, that the cradle was hers, and that warmth meant not decay but preparation. Thus Vey's legacy surfaced not as memory nor as scandal, but as evidence carved in flesh and preserved against time. The city avoided naming him, avoided naming anything, as though silence could serve as burial. Yet the hearts remained, each one with its number, each one still intact, and the cradle waiting for a child that had never come, or perhaps one that had already risen unseen, And so his work endured, not through his writings or his smile, but through the last pulse he trapped in glass, still beating in those who dared to uncover his truth. Jonas Vey was never convicted. His name slipped through the cracks of law like water through stone, not because his crimes were invisible, but because they were too structured, too carefully arranged to appear as crimes at all. The ledgers he left behind read like medical notes. The chambers beneath his asylum were sealed as anomalies of architecture, not tombs, and the patients who vanished were catalogued as recoveries, each disappearance swallowed by bureaucratic ink that no one dared to challenge. To convict him would have meant unraveling not only his work but also the system that had allowed it to thrive. And so silence became the verdict, and time became his accomplice. The strange thing about silence is that it does not bury ideas, it preserves them. Vey's writings, though scattered, were never destroyed. His private notions of soul probability and spiritual grafting trickled into academic discussions under gentler names concealed as theories of vitality potential and the economics of treatment. By the turn of the century, his influence lingered like an infection beneath the skin of medicine, waiting for an age more receptive to its cold efficiency. That age arrived in Europe in the shadow of rising powers that prized order over compassion. In Vienna, 1941, a hospital ward gathered not in mourning but in calculation. A quiet conference was held, and the program bore a name no one spoke aloud in public: Jonas Vey. His doctrine was stripped of its ritual, its whispers of saints and cradles, and distilled into something far more dangerous: practicality. The language had shifted, but the intent was the same. Patients were assigned value not for who they were, but for what they might produce. How much of themselves could be measured against a scale of usefulness? The same numbers that Vey had scrawled beside jars of preserved hearts became statistics printed on government forms. He had dreamed of filtering the soul. They spoke of filtering the population. What he had done in shadows became policy in fluorescent light. The horror was no longer in one man's obsession, but in the speed with which entire systems embraced it, once stripped of its madness and dressed in clean logic. The doctrine found soil beyond Europe too, carried by journals and conferences that spoke of mercy only as a cost, and of healing only when it could be measured. By the 1960s in New York, quiet debates emerged about how far treatment should extend when a patient was no longer fully sentient. Committees drafted guidelines with phrases disturbingly close to Vey's. Some argued that a body without consciousness was a vessel no different from his preserved hearts, waiting only for release. To them, the question was not about morality, but about resources, about efficiency, about mercy recast as mathematics. The ghost of Vey smiled through their pens, guiding hands that never knew his name. It was not until 1977, after decades of whispers and failed protections, that a law was passed in New York: the Patient Vitality Protection Act. Its language was careful, almost hesitant, as though ashamed of what it was addressing. It banned experimental treatments on patients who could not prove full sentience, requiring verification that a mind remained intact before a body could be altered in the name of progress. Lawmakers pretended it was new, but in truth it was a belated answer to something that had been alive for generations. The act was not about preventing a man like Jonas Vey. It was about admitting, too late, that he had already shaped the world. Yet his survival was not in jars or cradles, nor even in conferences that bore his name. It was in the quiet acceptance of a logic that chose order over empathy. Evil does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers in the tone of efficiency, wears the mask of reason, and sits comfortably in the offices of administrators who believe they are only doing what is necessary. Vey understood this better than most. His genius was not his experiments, but his ability to convince others that what he did was the language of progress, that cruelty could be translated into numbers until no one dared call it cruelty anymore. And once such language exists, it cannot be undone. It passes from hand to hand, becoming less about belief and more about procedure, until the hand that signs the paper is as guilty as the one that held the scalpel. The final horror is not that Vey lived, nor that he escaped, but that his doctrine became anonymous. When medicine served logic over mercy, his name no longer mattered. His handwriting faded, but his arithmetic remained, absorbed into systems that preferred silence to confrontation. Bureaucracy became his tongue, and through it he continued to speak long after his body was dust. The question that remains is not whether Jonas Vey still lives, but how many doctors live like him. How many see the soul as a distraction, something that leaves early, something that can be ignored once the body is still. How many more walk the halls, smiling gently, their ledgers neat, their hearts cold, waiting for the world to admit once again that silence is easier than mercy. And in that silence, the doctrine remains,